War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 19, the Indirect Approach. Some call this a strategy, and some a tactic. It seems to pop up often at the operational level. It is somewhat all of the above and, to a degree, common sense. It is not the solution to all problems, despite its greatest proponent, but by no means inventor, Basil Henry Liddell Hart would have us to believe, better known as B.H. Liddell Hart. Little Hart, like so many of the great names of 20th century war, was a scarred product of World War I. He was wounded several times during the war. Retired early from the military due to his wounds from shell and poison gas, he went on to be a writer and journalist. And again, like so many of his era, he came away convinced of one thing: never charge head-on into a prepared defense. And like so many of his era, he also came away convinced that his way was, in fact, the only way, and spent the bulk of his life shoehorning every military victory in history as a lesson in the indirect approach, which can be summed up as simply, attack the enemy where he doesn't expect it. In the non-military application, an indirect approach can be seen as avoidance of defenses, intellectual or otherwise. In my writing, I often, and much to the chagrin and frustration of my sometime co-author and always editor, would wait until halfway through the piece to get to the point. Commander Lawler, always the naval officer, demanded a direct approach. However, as I invariably sought to slay sacred cows, I wished to lull the audience with an establishment of mutually agreed upon points, thus complacent and agreeable to my perspective. I only then attacked the status quo. Had I started with the frontal attack, my reader would possibly abandon the piece with zero desire to see the reasoning or logic behind the initial point. This can work verbally and in writing. Anytime you are up against a strong, immobile defensive position, mental or physical, an indirect approach must be seen as a preferred tactic. Some have made the indirect approach synonymous with flanking attacks or envelopments. A flanking attack hits the side of the enemy's position, whereas an envelopment penetrates behind the enemy, usually maneuvering along the side, and then comes from behind the enemy. Both seek to find a seam in a continuous defense. The real question is how deep they go. The flanking attack will almost always attack the main effort of the enemy's defense, whereas an envelopment may often avoid the enemy altogether and attack rear bases or simply sit astride his lines of communication, otherwise known as supply lines, and establish a hasty defense to await a hasty counterattack by a panicked enemy. But really, an indirect approach can often be a discreet and stealthy penetration through the main lines of defense. Anything which does something the enemy didn't predict, and thus mentally unbalancing the enemy commander and rendering their positions less effective than if attacked as they had planned. All right, brilliant, easy. Only way to do it, right? Well, there are some problems at every level. Going back to the principles of war, this one is all about surprise. But it absolutely depends on security. If the enemy figures out what you are doing, you have just exposed your flank entirely. You are also stretched out, violating mass. For one of the principles of the indirect attack is the enemy must be fixed in place. So you need a holding force to keep the enemy's attention, and you need a mobile flanking force. If you don't outnumber the enemy, this split can be disastrous. The enemy may take the opportunity to either attack the flanking force or drive straight to the holding force and break their positions. Now, instead of a neat victory, you have a hairball of a fight, with mobile forces running rampant in each other's rear areas. Now the victory goes to those with the most nimble-minded tactical commanders and best-trained troops, which they were probably going to win anyway. This mobile, chaotic fight would favor those who are weaker in indirect fire capability in theory. Bashing Winston Churchill seems to be the thing to do recently, so I have come to praise Churchill, not to bash him, and thus I shall defend his Gallipoli plan against the slings and arrows of the criminally incompetent. First, Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, was in charge of the Navy, which still maintained complete control of the seas and which was rendered almost irrelevant by the fighting in France. Gallipoli controlled the Dardanelles Straits and access to the Black Sea. Churchill hoped to seize control of the straits, use his battleships to bombard the Turks, and provide a supply route to the Russians, also fighting the Germans. This would also relieve pressure on the Mediterranean and Suez Canal. Most importantly, it would avoid the trench warfare that was now the brutal norm on the Western Front. The plan was to use minesweepers to clear out the mines and the guns on obsolete battleships to destroy, or at least subdue, the artillery controlling the Dardanelles. The initial attack commenced on 19 February, following an aerial recon. By the 25th, despite bad weather, the minesweepers had cleared a path, and the artillery had been silenced. Royal Marines landed to ensure mobile artillery didn't return. Admiral Carden, the commander, paused for planning, but on foremarch ensured Churchill he would be at Istanbul in a fortnight. And then Carden had a nervous breakdown the day the main attack was scheduled and was replaced by Admiral de Robeck. De Robeck attacked the day after he took command and again had initial success. But a ship struck a mine and sunk. Here was the narrowest part of the straits, barely a mile across. The Ottoman artillery had been isolated and suppressed, their communication wires cut, and they were nearly out of ammunition. The British minesweepers were manned by civilians and retreated without orders and without loss under ineffective Ottoman artillery fire. And soon after, HMS Irresistible and then HMS Inflexible both hit mines. Irresistible sunk and Inflexible badly hurt. Rumors swirled that torpedoes caused the loss. HMS Ocean sailed to rescue the crew of Irresistible and then was hit by another mine and eventually sunk. At this, de Robeck could take no more and sounded retreat. While many ships had been hit by artillery, none were sunk. But de Robeck, far beyond the plan envisioned by Churchill, decided to make a landing at Gallipoli and use ground forces to seize the terrain around the straits to protect the minesweepers from artillery for another chance. Disdainful of the Turkish infantry, ignorant of the terrain, any attempt at indirect approach was over. The surprise was gone, the initiative with the Turks, now fighting in prepared positions in very rocky terrain. In the end, each side lost 56,000 killed. Of these, only 12,000 were Anzacs. 9,000 were French, and 31,000 from the various parts of the British Empire. Almost all the casualties were well after the naval battle had been abandoned, and a foolish year of fruitless attacks slogged on. No different than what was happening on the Western Front, only on a smaller scale. The plan was solid. Many in the battle thought they would have won had they continued on, as the stricken Entente ships had, in admittedly horrific fashion, cleared the bulk of the minefields. Had the Allies simply sailed away, the failed attempt at Gallipoli would have been a footnote. Desperate to deflect attention from the mindless slaughter in Flanders, inordinate focus was made on the disaster at Gallipoli, mostly to attack the bombastic and relatively young Churchill, who resigned in disgrace, took up his army commission, and commanded somewhat nobly an infantry battalion on the front lines in France. De Robeck went on to have a very distinguished career, inexplicably rewarded for his, frankly, cowardly ineptness. This was not Churchill's last attempt at an indirect approach. While Gallipoli was an operational concept focused mostly on diversion and logistics, with zero thought it would end the war, Churchill remained enamored of the concept of attacking and defeating Germany through the Mediterranean, geography notwithstanding. During World War II, having obviously recovered from the Gallipoli disaster and now Prime Minister, Churchill sought to avoid the Atlantic wall Germany had created to defend coastal France and saw invading what he phrased as the soft underbelly of the Axis. Starting with clearing German and Italians out of North Africa with the torch landings to secure control of the Mediterranean, then to Sicily with Operation Husky, then to Italy with the amphibious landings as part of Operation Avalanche, up the Italian peninsula, somehow across the Alps, and then into Germany. General Marshall wanted nothing to do with this nonsense and wanted to invade France directly in 1942, no later than 1943. This was no mere operational sideshow. Churchill was adamant for the strategy, and FDR relented. It was, as previously mentioned, an absolute waste of men and material. It simply delayed the inevitable invasion of France by 2 years and allowed more time to build the Atlantic Wall defenses, which were essentially non-existent in 1942. Now, I am a huge Churchill fan. It is my personal belief, with zero evidence to support it, that Churchill's true intent was to delay the invasion of France and later Germany, as long as possible, and to let the Soviets and Germans slog it out as long as possible, attriting both. Churchill was as anti-communist as he was anti-fascist. His seeming strategic foolishness supporting a solid grand strategy of weakening Stalin as well as Hitler. If this was his intent, the surrender of Central Europe to Stalin at Yalta proved to be its undoing. Yet another indirect approach strategy down the tubes. Overlord can be seen as the operational indirect approach, landing at Normandy and avoiding the obvious Pas-de-Calais. MacArthur at Inchon, the same. As a tactic and operational concept, it seems to work. Strategically, few enemies worthy of concern would be so foolish as to leave their strategic center of gravity exposed to an unexpected attack from an unexpected direction. If such a gap was left, I'd be concerned of a trap more than an opportunity. So what are the aspects of a successful use of the indirect strategy? First, the enemy must be fixated on terrain. During the American Civil War, Sherman's march to the sea and then swing northward to crush Lee between Meade's Army of the Potomac took advantage of both the numeric superiority of the Northern forces and Lee's requirement to guard Richmond, the Confederate capital. Thus trapped, he could do nothing to counter Sherman without leaving Richmond open to direct attack by Meade. Second, you must ensure that the force maneuvering deep behind enemy lines is both sufficiently mobile as well as logistically secure. B.H. Liddell Hart and the indirect approach almost became synonymous with mechanized warfare. A force moving too slowly becomes subject to attacks by enemy who can use their compressed position and interior lines to defeat the maneuvering force in detail and return to their defensive positions in time. No matter what, the indirect approach demands a splitting of forces. This abandonment of mass requires a steady commander and fast-moving, well-trained forces. If we accept the common wisdom of a 3-to-1 advantage required to successfully defeat an enemy in the defense, a 2-to-1 advantage may be all that is required if an indirect approach is used. However, now you incur the risk of a split force subject to defeat in detail. Additionally, you must have knowledge not only of your enemy, but of the terrain you plan on maneuvering through, putting a premium on even more mobile intelligence in cavalry, or, in more modern eras, aviation. And you are, if only temporarily, leaving your enemy forces intact. Compared to the risk of attacking on foot into Maxim machine guns and entrenched infantry, this is a no-brainer, if you can find a route undefended, which proved impossible within a month of the First World War. Against an enemy itself mechanized and with a functioning air force, it is a far less appealing proposition. The Israeli Defense Forces were a big fan of Liddell Hart and incorporated many of his tactical and operational considerations in developing their doctrine. First, they wished to seize the initiative and attack their enemy before the enemy was prepared for battle. The indirect aspect more focused on time than maneuver. Second, they never wished to attack the enemy in the defense. This isn't to say that they didn't or couldn't. In fact, in 1967, Ariel Sharon had a highly successful attack on a strong defensive position at Abu Agela that utilized aspects of the indirect approach by splitting a seam unknown by the Egyptians and still managing to attack from the rear. This after he attacked Egyptian forces in 1956 to, at best, mixed results in the Mitla Pass. In 1973, policy decisions by Golda Meir's Labor government precluded a preemptive strike. Trusting to the mobility of the armored forces and superior air force, Meir accepted the strategic risk for the diplomatic advantage of being attacked first. The Egyptians attacked and crossed the Suez, opposed by a thinly held defensive line known as the Bar-Lev Line. The Israelis hoped that the Bar-Lev Line would defend long enough for a counteroffensive to repel the Egyptian Second and Third Armies. The Egyptians set up defensive positions approximately 5 kilometers beyond the Suez and awaited the assumed counterattack. An Israeli brigade set off 2 days later, planning to exploit the edge of the Egyptian forces to the north and then swing south in a flanking attack along the artillery road. It was a solid plan, except the commander turned on the wrong road. Instead of rolling up the flank of the Egyptians, he drove his brigade about a kilometer in front of the Egyptian lines, giving them a perfect shot at the side of his entire brigade. The fog of war makes complicated plans risky, and the indirect approach, avoiding the known risk of a prepared defense, depends upon relatively complicated schemes of maneuver, which magnifies the effects of fog and friction. Weighed against the principles of war, the tactic of indirect approach is clearly not the answer to all problems. Simplicity and mass are, by necessity, abandoned. My own tactical attempts at flanking maneuvers in Afghanistan were thwarted at times by terrain, my dismounted mobility, and occasionally a capable enemy. No less than the fact that the Taliban were in no way fixed to any particular terrain except that which benefited them tactically at the moment. So even when I was successful in my maneuver, the enemy had usually vacated their position, nullifying my hard-earned efforts. Understanding what your enemy will do and countering it before he does it brings up another famous but more recently introduced concept of combat, that of Colonel John Boyd's OODA loop, which I will cover next week. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.